All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for being so patient with our little bit of tech trouble. So Halito, welcome back to today's edition of Chahta Tosholi's virtual speaker series. Saho Chifwa Megan Baker. I'm a research associate with historic preservation. Today, I'm so happy to host Teri and Curtis Billy as our Chahta Tosholi. Ms. Teri Billy is the Assistant Director of Chahta Anumpa Aikana, the School of Choctaw Language, and the very helpful first language speaker who helped me come up with the name for this series, actually. Both of them have taught me so much about Choctaw language, culture, and history over the years, and I'm really glad that they were able to join us today. Together, they've cared and sustained our language and culture, ensuring that future generations would learn the knowledge of our ancestors. As the assistant director of the language school, Miss Billy is much of the force behind getting Choctaw language taught in Oklahoma public schools, which was an effort that actually required state legislation to get Choctaw listed as a world language for Oklahoma state curriculums. Today, Chahta Anumpa is taught in 40 public high schools in Oklahoma, community classes across the United States, and in college classrooms. Curtis Billy, who some of you might know as Toady, is a Choctaw language instructor who teaches classes at Southeastern, and we might have some of his students in the audience today. They both worked with the committee to develop the new Choctaw Dictionary, which is a learner's dictionary that was published very recently. And this is, believe it or not, their second career. This is post-retirement work that they've done. Before they came to Choctaw Nation, the two of them both worked for Broken Bow Public Schools. Teri might have been your kindergarten teacher, and Tony might have been your high school counselor, or maybe you took a class with him, a class that he oversaw as the Indian Education Director. In 2003, Teri was a finalist for the Oklahoma State Teacher of the Year. And if you were ever a part of Choctaw churches in McCurtain County, or if you've ever been to the Choctaw Village at Labor Day, you might have watched or learned Choctaw social dancing and stickball from their demonstrations. And so this is just a small portion of the work that they've done over the years. And there's so much more that we have to learn from them. So I'm going to kind of start and turn to the interview portion. All right, welcome. How are you doing today? Okay, so first question. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from?
Okay, I'll start. I originally grew up in Wright City, Oklahoma, just about 18 miles from Broken Bow, and was raised by my aunts and cousins, and graduated there, and met Curtis, and we married while in college. And after college, Curtis got a job at Broken Bow Public School and community liaison person, kind of had a double role there. And I stayed behind to keep my studies at Southeastern, graduated, and then we made our home in Broken Bow, and I've been teaching and taught there for about 29 years. And from there, I was asked to come and help build up the language program in Durant. And so I was specifically asked to build the Head Start program, which we were able to do that with the online learning and beaming out to all the Head Start centers. And at first, I wasn't on the Polycom through the distance learning, so I had to travel around every month for 2 weeks out of the month. I was going to every single center, going to one or two every day, and I'd hit all of them and come back to work and start on my lessons again and go back and out. So I did that for about 6 months until we got some assistants and some other Choctaw fluent speakers who could carry on the job while I continued working on a curriculum that would span for the whole year. And as of now, with the help of Leo Ward, we now have 2 years of ongoing language lessons that we beam out to the Head Start. And from there, I taught a couple of high school. I also, in addition to working with the Head Start program, I started teaching some high school classes online, not online, but through this high school and then eventually became the assistant director of the language department, which that has been very rewarding and satisfying. We've seen the production of the dictionary and overseeing community classes and seeing the growth that goes on there, and just a lot of other things.
Yes, and I'm Curtis Billy, and I went to school in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, and I probably lived as far as go out into the woods, and so that was always a great experience for me compared to today. But the idea of going to school without speaking English was also an encounter that was actually time that most Indian students, particularly Choctaw and Broken Bow, went to school that way. And our generation may have been one of the last to do that, but yet we learned the language. I learned the language within that year to speak English, and so from there on, I've always enjoyed education and the process and so forth that went along with it, and of course the athletics and the arts and things like that, and all the extracurricular activities that went along with all those types of things. So I enjoyed doing those, and I went to college, got a degree, bachelor's degree in art education, and I taught 1 year in Miami Public School, and it so happened that they received a grant with the Indian education. It was the first year that they could implement it, so I implemented the what we call Indian Arts and Crafts class for the middle school and high school, and we also enjoyed doing beadwork, all the leather, the jewelry, silverwork, pottery, weaving, just almost anything that you could think of, and that pertained, as well as drawing and painting, and so that was an enjoyable year. And I got hired, got my master's degree over the summer, and then I went. Both public schools called and wanted me to become a counselor there, so I agreed, and from there I stayed at Broken Bow Schools for 30 years. So in my career, I spent 31 years there, and then 15 years with the Choctaw language program. So it's been a real exciting, yet at the same time sometimes challenging, but it's something that I enjoy doing. So it's the language is very important. We've always worked with language at all levels. Even in Broken Bow, we had the under the Indian education program, we had a high school Choctaw language class for credit, and also the Indian Arts and Crafts class that I implemented in Miami. I implemented the same thing in Broken Bow, and so they were able to receive credit for the Indian Arts and Crafts class, and that still exists today in the Broken Bow Public Schools, as well as the youth council that was formed, and that's mainly where we did a lot of the culture, the dance, the stickball, and this was in the mid-70s. So it predates a lot of things, and I think probably in 76 was probably the first year that we performed at Tushkahoma for the Labor Day activities. And in those days, I think it was just one day. And we did stickball exhibition and dance exhibitions. And then from there on, I believe I haven't missed Labor Day dance and stickball exhibition, except we will this year. So I don't know how many years that's been, 40 something, probably close to 50. But anyway, that's part of my background, plus the speaking of the language, which we always did, even in school or before, like if we were in athletic, like playing ball of any sort, then we had several Choctaw around, so we would speak to each other in Choctaw. So a lot of times, particularly if the other side didn't have any Choctaws or Choctaw speakers, so it was a language that we could use and utilize, and of course the humor was always probably the better thing that we could do with it. And at church we spoke all Choctaw, and all the activities in the Choctaw language was pretty much prevalent in my sphere of interaction with people outside of school, and maybe going into town and going to the shops and markets and things like that. But other than that, strictly Choctaw events and Choctaw types of activities that I participated in. And I think Teri was pretty similar. I'm sure she probably knew more English than I did when she went to school, but it's been a great emphasis to, we've always taught Choctaw maybe to other people or to school children, and we've always had activities doing that. So these are things that we just have a calling on our life to make sure that it continues from this point on. And so that's our endeavor, for it to last at least another 100 years. Makalla.
Yeah, so talked about is how you spoke a lot of Choctaw in the churches. And I know there's such a really long history about missionaries and the language and the churches. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that history.
Well, it's just like with everyone else. As you move along in life, you begin to wonder about your culture, and you're curious, and you start digging and reading. But the influence that the missionaries brought, and you want to tell the part about them bringing in education first, and then I'll go into Byington a little bit.
Okay.
Do you want us to go into Byington, or just?
Yeah, just because some people don't know about that.
Back it up. I'll let him back it up.
Okay. In the 1816, 17, Choctaws put in a request. The tribe put in a request to the federal government, and of course, in that time, the United States were just very few states. It hadn't gone beyond the Mississippi River, and so the Choctaw asked for education for their children and youth, and at that time there were no public education or state-funded education of any sort, and most education at that time were the European style of where they educated the males primarily, and also they were held in churches or community sites, and from there, one room classes and so forth for all ages. And and so the federal government just sent the request on into the churches, and this happened to be the Northern Board of the Protestant churches, and the Presbyterians picked it up, and they sent missionaries into what is now Mississippi, Alabama area, but primarily where in those days Choctaws primarily occupied Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of Florida, and some lived near Georgia and up towards Tennessee and back to the Mississippi River. And therefore there were no states. And so we had a conglomeration of people that lived in different areas. And so each area had their own leadership of chief and council. And so when the chiefs would get together, they would elect one to be the principal chief. And within that, they would also allow the rest of the chiefs would be the council. And so they would meet in that form. And so this is how they function in government in that day. And so the request went, and the request was answered by the Presbyterian churches. And so they sent out missionaries, and the first missionary that came in 1816 and 1817, when he actually began to get the Choctaw people to build classroom and that type of school building, and so they spent that year doing mainly the construction, and at the next year they implemented classes, and one of the teachers that happened to be sent over for that year was Cyrus Byington, and he had studied to become a lawyer, and he was working as an apprentice in law, and then he had a call to become a missionary, and so he left his law profession and went into the missionary field among the Presbyterians. And again, to speak a little bit about Mr. Byington, he was influenced by the Great Awakening in the country at that time, and therefore he was one that thought he would probably go to another continent like Africa or someplace like that, but they sent him among the Choctaws, and one of the things that he wanted to do was to put the New Testament into Choctaw language, and he asked for funds and things, permission from the Northern Board of Commissioners, and they denied him and said that's impossible to put a native language into the print, particularly interpreting the scriptures. So they, but he didn't listen. He went ahead and did it. He started, and a lot of the school in that day, they learned not only English, the core, the math, the sciences, and history, and also they learned to read and write Choctaw as well as English. They were Choctaw speakers and were learning English, but at the same time, the students were able to read and write their own language for the first time. And so the encouragement, and Mr. Byington in that year also learned enough of the language that he had like 90 sermons in Choctaw. And of course, there were a lot of conversions into Christianity also. So the Great Awakening also hit the Choctaws, the Choctaw Nation at that time. And so Choctaws became important as far as their lifestyle into churches, but also the education allowed the parents and non-school age and some school age, if they wanted to, that weren't going to school, to have Saturday school, which allowed Choctaw to, they learned to read and write Choctaw. They were already speakers, so that was the purpose of Saturday school. And most of the times, whole families attended, and therefore, within a few times beyond that, the Choctaw interpreters for Mr. Byington in compiling words, and he was his goal was to interpret the New Testament or translate it into Choctaw. And as he was working with that, he had several Choctaws that were part of his staff in order to implement those types of words. And of course, there were 7 dialects at the time of Choctaw, and they mainly took the main one that was in the area, which today probably would be called like Sixtown. But in that time, several Choctaws became well educated. They became instructors of the schools, and they built different schools in different locations, and always had church activities. And the dictionary that Mr. Byington was compiling, and he was always revising it, and so that's what we have today, as well as 2 or 3 others that have been part of it, but his dictionary is probably more complete than any other, and it dates back to the 1800s. So we have probably more accurate language from that time to now because of that endeavor. And so in order to accomplish those kind of things, and in that time frame, within a couple of years after that, around 1818 and so forth on, more missionaries came to assist, and one guy was Loren S. Williams, and he started a lot of the hymnals, and so you can see that on the bottom of Choctaw hymns there's some initials, and if it has LSM, LSW, that's Loren S. Williams' name, or if it has CB, it's not Curtis Billy, it's Cyrus Byington. And so, but they compiled the first Choctaw hymnal book in 1824, printed. And so if we go back, in the same Choctaw hymns that we've seen were sung before the Trail of Tears. In other words, they learned to read and write and sing the Choctaw hymns also. And a lot of the Choctaw hymns were tunes to English hymnals or English music, but they also added the Choctaw interpretation to some, and some are just original Choctaw, and some have Choctaw music added to it. And so over the years, there's very few addition to those songs, since the 1800s. Of course, they added revisions throughout those years, uh, leading up, till probably in the 1890s. But the tunes could change. And then, if you know anything about music, which I don't, another number on that will have like the meters of the song. And so if it has a CM, that means common meter. And so you can sing those Choctaw hymnals that have CM to tunes that have common meter uh, beat or rhythm in music. And so the other has other line meters and stuff on that you can do that. Plus, on the back of the hymnals, there's instruction like uh, on living and on also some of the what we call articles of faith, and also what I'm trying to get to, so let me go ahead and get to it first before I forget it, is that it has the wedding vows in it, and so in Choctaw. So they would utilize that, and that size of that book that we have was purposely made for that size so that the ministers could carry them in their pockets, and so they could pull it out, and if they were doing a wedding ceremony, they could follow that if they wanted to. They didn't necessarily have to. Choctaws before Christianity had wedding ceremonies, and they were also done by people like the chief or someone designated in communities and so forth, that what we might say comparable to the justice of peace, that type of thing. And within that realm, the Choctaw culture moved into the church arena, and therefore the church began all of the things that we possess today, and the activities kind of revolved around that, as well as the things that Choctaws had already implemented. And one of the things that's unique would be that when before the Europeans came, the first European 1550, the Spaniards came, and within that, this Hernando de Soto and his men came through, and they brought several animals, and some of the animals that they brought, one of them was a swine, or what we call hog, pig, Chahta. And so from that time until Choctaws became Christians, they never ate the swine. They called it unclean, and therefore they never ate it until they read the scriptures in their language, of where it's not what you put in your mouth that defiles the person, but what comes out. And that all things, this is in the New Testament. And so this is where Peter had his vision of a sheep coming down, and all the unclean Jewish animals that weren't kosher for them to eat, then they would, it indicated to him that it was okay. And so that meant the non-Jewish, non-Israelites could become part of the Christian life, and therefore, before that, it was a Jewish-only belief system, and therefore, it was the Old Covenant. So in the New Covenant, after Jesus came, then that was where the Choctaws had received that understanding. Of course, they always raised the swine and sold it to Naholos, or Europeans that were settlers or coming around, and they would trade for them, and so, but they never ate it, and so that's one of the unique things that the Choctaws actually did, and today it's our delicacy, and so from that point on. But there was a time that Choctaws didn't indulge in Shokandipi. But today, you had to beat us away in order to keep from eating it, especially if you cook it outside, traditionally under coals, hot coals and fire, and fry it out like that. And so those are some of the things that would be unique. But before that, people often ask why do people why do Choctaws become Christian? But in Choctaw way of belief system, they had a priesthood style of living, and they had prophets and so forth of the tribe, and so the priest would be one that would hear from deity or from God, and relay and would take the needs of the people and take that and offer up prayers and so forth up to God, and so and then the prophets heard from God, and they would speak to the people of the things that that they often received. And one of the things that's unique is, and this may be similar with a lot of tribes, and they assume that sometimes people would have kind of like a seizure, whether today they would call it a seizure, but people that often had seizures, then they honored those people because they assumed that they were hearing from God. And so many of them became the prophets and of the tribe because of that type of identifying, because they would speak things that they probably didn't realize what they were saying until they were, but it wasn't while they were in convulsion, but that was just a sign that person has knowledge beyond the natural, that kind of thing. And some Indian tribes do that, and so, or believe in that, and so Choctaw was one of them. At the same time, they were informed that by oral tradition that what figure came that spoke to them, and he said he would return again, and they assumed afterwards that this was Jesus, and in Jesus' scripture, he says something about going and see his, during his death, the 3 days afterwards, he went among his people, but he also, according to not only Choctaws, but several tribal people, that they have oral information that he came and spoke to them, and therefore they were always looking for that second coming. And so when the Christianity was spoken in their language and they understood it, and so it made sense with the prophecies of the old or oral traditions that they already had, and therefore that was one of the inclinations of the people to become Christians. And incidentally, they lived similar to in their ceremonial activities like the Jewish custom, and that was of the old covenant. And again, several people that Europeans observed some of that would think that the native people in the eastern half of the United States seem to have been part of what they called the lost tribes, 10 tribes of Israel, because some of the customs and activities that they had, within that. So that was some of their bases, and there's ancient history about those kinds of things that sometimes I research. But one of the things that was important to that is, in my estimation, I only look at it naturally as a neutral person. So I don't personally believe whether native tribes in North America or part of them are Israelites or not. I just read it, so I'm just giving it for information. I'm not promoting one or the other. I'm just saying that that's some of the things that prevailed in those days, and so the Bering Strait theory sometimes is more of a intellectual reasoning of historians of their day, because the oral traditions of many tribes doesn't coincide with that, other than probably people that live within that area and still do. That would probably be accurate for them, and so those are some of the things that are mysterious. But academia in this country has always wanted to be on the same page, and so today a lot of things that are being unearthed and dated supersede a lot of their theories, and so a lot of artifacts and things of natives of this country sometimes are considered not accurate, or maybe just copy made and to make claims and so forth, but they predate Europeans coming to this country. And so there's a whole new different look into that type of thing. So it's exciting to know that, because I think the only people that can probably straighten it out would be the native people of this land. And so we look to our future natives to uncover all of that at some point and set history correct. And because we have our own academia that's entwined with oral tradition and our culture and tradition and our language. So that indicates to us our language is important, so that we can tie in those types of events that preceded us in oral tradition, as well as maintaining our identity, as Choctaw. And so as a group of people, as Choctaw, I think we have a language and we should maintain it, and that defines us as Choctaw. And because other countries do that, now, for instance, what defines Russia, their language? What defines France, their language, and so forth, all around the country, Spain, Spanish. So as tribal nations and as groups, our language defines us in that manner. So I think it's well important, and there's a resurgence of the youth wanting to learn the language today. And so as part of the Choctaw nation, and we're trying to increase that type of language, not only the speaking and teaching and reading, writing, and all of those things, but utilizing it so that we can also maintain the accuracy of it, the sounds, the emphasis, the tone, the humor. And there's several humor, things that we could speak in Choctaw and it would be hilarious. And then we could interpret it into English and it wouldn't be funny at all. So that's the difference of language, for example, not only in humor, but in all other areas. So we tie in language is culture, language is definition and defining of who we are in all areas of life, spiritually, socially, educationally, and economically, in all of those areas, all the spheres of natural life. And therefore, language is important to us for that reason. And so education became a part of that and increased. And during the removal, what we call the Trail of Tears, and incidentally, Choctaws were the ones that coined the phrase Trail of Tears. They were coming across Arkansas through Little Rock, right down through town, traveling across, and one of the newspaper for the Little Rock, I won't say Herald, but anyway, Gazette or something like that, came out and asked Chief Nitakachi if what it was like on the trip, and he said some things other than the main quote that they remember was that he said it's been a trail of death and of tears, and so they left out the death, but they just put Trail of Tears. And so every other tribe that were removed that called theirs Trail of Tears also used that same Trail of Tears label, and it was because several people died along the route and so forth, and it was hardship, but Choctaws prevailed. And again, one of the important things was their spiritual understanding, their spiritual life, and also many of the gospel hymns that they sung. Some of the informants that witnessed some of these sounded like continuous church service, along the route. But and I'm sure they also sang some traditional songs too. But it was in a language that non-Choctaws didn't understand, but the Choctaws did, because that was their faith being expressed in that this life wasn't the end, that there's eternity. And so that's always been the Choctaw belief, even before eternity. Eternity was eternal life was always a goal of the Choctaw before Christianity. And so that was one of the things that also implemented the Choctaw to become Christians. Not all of them, but a majority of them were converted into that realm, and a lot of them, and we still practiced our culture. Our culture just went into the church arena in most our language, our food, our song, music, our attitude, customs, and burial. All those types of things would be in effect and still with us today. So education was so prevalent that after the removal, they moved all of the school activities after 7 years into what is now Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, which is a Choctaw word, Okla and Homa, but they excelled in their education that the neighboring schools in Arkansas and Texas wanted to send their Naholo kids to Choctaw schools. It was that great, and they also hired a person across the ocean in England that they had the greatest innovation of teaching at that time, and so Choctaws hired that guy, and he sent over people to implement that in addition to their already top quality education system. So education has always been an important part of the Choctaw people in that realm. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I'll just go ahead and stop there, because we could spend 2 days on all of this, and so it's important. And there is a book that we have called Schools of the Choctaw by Dr. Morrison, who was a history professor at Southeastern, and so that's available today. And we had he was a part of the staff with the that in the early 70s, when the Choctaw bilingual program was implemented at Southeastern, and Teri was one of the students, as well as 4 or 5 of the current language teachers today. And so under that program, they learned the grammar and those kinds of things of the language, and implemented what you can within the school frame. And so that leads us to where we are today. And our curriculum is not so much the traditional grammar and where you learn the reading, the spelling and grammar and identifying what a noun is, verb is, object, and all of that. You learn that, but that's not our emphasis. So our style is acquisition, which means you acquire the speaking, reading, writing, comprehension of the language. But within that, you also learn grammar and punctuation and all of the emphasis that you would learn in the language class. So the acquisition is foremost more progression oriented. You might start with the greetings, halito, chumachokwan, go into conversation from there, learn your nouns nouns in Choctaw are singular and plural. Like in English, for instance, we might say the animal deer. So if you see one deer, that's a deer. But if you see 10, you still say 10 deer. You don't put an S on it unless you live in southeastern Oklahoma. You might hear people say deers, but in those kinds of things, you'll see that all of our nouns are like that. And what makes it plural would be either quantity. We quantify it in some way with numbers or many or a whole lot or a few. Other than that, it's singular, or that's how we make it plural. But anyway, some of those kinds of things are very important to the language, and it's something that provides us some. Before that, the schools of the Choctaws actually had 535 or 34 components of what we call curriculum for the schools. And all that disappeared after statehood because statehood put into Choctaw sovereignty as far as government and running your own businesses and your own school and so forth until it was renewed again in the late 60s and put into effect in 1970. And so we regained our governmental sovereignty from that point on to now. In an act called Worcester versus Georgia, 1828 and 29, then the Supreme Court of this small country, federal Supreme Court of the United States in that time, ruled that Indian nations were a nation within a nation, and therefore having dual citizenship in that order. Of course, it wasn't until Andrew Jackson happened to become president in 1829, and so the 5 tribes, particularly Choctaw, brought that to his indication of that we don't have to be removed because we're a sovereign nation and we have the right to live here and so forth in their area, which they had ceded land into what is now pretty much just Mississippi and little parts of Alabama, and so central part and little southern part of Mississippi, and so they Andrew Jackson indicated that the Mississippi had become a state and they have jurisdiction, and as a federal person, he said he couldn't interfere with it, and so therefore that also gave the states right to have jurisdiction over other governments, and particularly native governments, Choctaw in this case. So they weren't allowed to hold their government or their chiefs or the council or make legislation. And as usual, if they did, they could be imprisoned, punished by law, even to death. And therefore, imprisonment things like that. So that would be part of the influence in order, for removal. But again, that's just some part of it. And so back to our school type of interest, our schools, most of their uh, uh, information from the old country and what is now Mississippi and all of that area uh, came with the Trail of Tears. So with the Choctaw Nation into us country. So anybody that made the federal treaty as a nation sovereignly, like the Choctaws did, are considered the Choctaw Nation. So we're considered the Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory, and any other Choctaws that are there, let's say in Mississippi, Louisiana, so forth, are considered bands. And so their federal definition is Mississippi Band of Choctaw, Louisiana Band of Choctaw, or they may have some type of names to that. And so officially, under the federal government treaties, we are the Choctaw Nation, and therefore we possess all that written information with us during the removal, and we rebuilt our schools in within 5 years, and implemented was going in effect real good within 7 years, and the removal was 1830, 31, and 30 and 31, and yet I don't know who all were removed afterward, but the Cherokees were removed and signed their treaty at New Chahta in 1838. So I don't know who else came in between that. So that you can see that eventually all the other 5 tribes had a time and date to be removed into Indian Territory. And so education has always been a part of us, and today it's still a great emphasis. And at one time, the censuses in the 1980s showed that the Choctaws had more, and I think in the 90s too, but it showed that Choctaws had more college graduates than any tribe in the nation. And so I don't know whether that meant that, indicates that education is important to us as Choctaw people, as well as our culture and language and history and who we are, and our definition of being Choctaw. And so that's continues on. Of course, when we hit the boarding school era, where the statehood ended our sovereignty, then unknowingly, by not having federal oversight into implementing our sovereignty, then we can see that that same Worcester versus Georgia was the precedent that the 5 tribes sued the federal government for, to regain sovereignty back for the Indian tribes in all of the United States. So, and so we started implementing that in the 1970s. So we're still new at our sovereignty, since we've been in effect just from the 70s, maybe 50 years, 51, 52 years. But we have the idea of the importance, as our visionaries who asked for education. They wanted Choctaw in the future to not only be well educated and participants of the larger country, communities, and society, as well as maintain their culture and their language, or let me correct that, to maintain our language, our culture, our way of life at the same time. And they were able to do that before statehood, and now we're able to do that certainly in this age, so that we have fulfilled that vision, and we're to maintain it from here on in that realm. So that's the importance of all of the Choctaw culture, history, language, economics, and also social, and all of the things that make us in faith, spirituality, all those things that make us humans also make us who we are in our Choctaw realm. So anyway, that's where education has assisted us, not only written and oral traditions. Okay, I'll return this back to Teri.
Yeah, well, as everyone can kind of see, one question when you ask Todi, it kind of goes all different ways because he knows so much about history and law and linguistics, and there's a it's so clear that he's so wise and knows so many kinds of things, and so one question becomes very long and elaborate. But then it also helps us see how kind of interconnected all of like knowing about the churches and how that kind of has affected us into the present. And so these are all interconnected. And so sometimes it's not easy for a single answer, but it's really important to kind of know all those things and see how everything is connected. Was there anything that you wanted to add to that, Teri?
I was just sitting here thinking, contemporary wise, what would be the influence of the church, the missionaries and the church, and the works that continued on, and just thinking about how we grew up as children in the church, and like we said, yes, there were people who, not everybody was Christian, but the majority of families were connected to a church. There is a church because the church was built in the center, and the camp houses are in a circle around it. So there's your circular influence of your culture, and where the church is the center, just like it was before. And so, all children, all of us just within our generations just grew up the same way. And it wasn't until some years later, back in the 80s, Curtis and I were dorm counselors, and we were asked to work with Johnson O'Malley. They were having leadership conferences during the summer for a week or two all across the state of Oklahoma. And we ended up at OU, and it took over the whole summer. So we also went to OU for a couple of weeks. And one thing that we consistently saw, and whether it's a bragging point or not, but the students were always asked to do a presentation night, over whatever it was, a speech or a song or something anyway, because it was a leadership conference. So they were wanting, output from the students. And so one of the things that we just kind of took us aback, but we had to realize that it came from our culture and our upbringing in the churches. And so we looked at these students who were like from other tribes, and I don't want to name any tribes, but and like I said, in this instance, we were joined in with Western tribes and Eastern tribes. And consistently, our young people didn't have a problem getting up, standing up, speaking, singing, talking. And, and so Curtis and I talked about it, and we said it has to be because we were all raised from early on. As soon as you could get up and talk, you could get up and walk, they herded all us young kids onto the stage at the church and said, now you have to sing. And so we'd have to stand up there and sing. And we did this from the time we were 4 or 5 up until we were teenagers. And in teenagers, we would try to hide behind each other, because you didn't want to be standing up front. And we all heard the same thing. Don't do that. You're up at the front. Put your head up. Let people hear what you're saying. They want to see your face. Don't be shy. Don't be this and don't be that. So, there was a lot of cultural upbringing that also helped. We could see our students that came from our neck of the woods just didn't have any inhibitions because they grew up with that. So, that was just something that just always stuck with me because it's just a true, I don't know what the words I'm looking for, but a measure of, or a trait or something that we've exhibited. And I think another time that I so appreciated the missionaries' work was we spent a few days one weekend with the Alabama Chahta, or some sister churches. And, we grew up hearing the scriptures being read in Choctaw and in English. It was just a given. It happened every Sunday. Didn't think anything about it. And so we went to visit our Alabama Chahta sister churches. And I was just mesmerized because I looked around and they didn't have what we had, a testament written in our language, a hymnal in the language. And so I figured out that there was one man that was a speaker of the language, and he knew both English and his language. So he would read from the English, and then he would stand up and he would interpret in his own language, Alabama Chahta language, what was being studied or what was being read. And I think that really just magnified my curiosity and my appreciation for knowing how our culture had come through the written word and reading and writing, and everything was written in writing. Land permits, weddings, arrest warrants. I mean, what have you? Letters to the judges and back and forth, and to Congress, back and forth, and treaties. Everything was written in Choctaw. That is just something that I think every Choctaw should know. That it's not just something that we're in passing that we're doing. We have a very rich culture of our language and our history that involves the language. That's all.
It's important because it also helps us to understand the uniqueness of Oklahoma Choctaws, like that we have a very rich written tradition. I don't know if I told you this, but I found uh like a for a railroad contract for like a railroad to be written in to go through Choctaw territory. It was in English and in Choctaw, and it's like, whoa, it's so kind of crazy that these kinds of documents that exist. So it is really unique to us, and I also like to share that with others as well. So
Right.
thank you.
That was the norm until statehood.
Exactly. Yeah. And so now I kind of want to ask you a little bit about when you started to bring dances, how you got the dances and how you went to Mississippi and kind of brought them here to Oklahoma. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with that?
Okay, I'll go so far and then I'll let him take over because I'll leave out a lot. But and I was thinking about this. I think one of the things we talked about was, when did we know we were Choctaw? And I always just knew that I was Choctaw, and I think probably because I was raised by a grandmother that spoke nothing but Choctaw, and she didn't want to learn English. What little she did, it was just really broken. And so in order for me to communicate with her, that's what I had to speak. So, I just maintained that type of knowing who I was through school, through high school, and, Curtis and I married. I was going somewhere, I forgot where I was going. Excuse me, I'm a senior moment. I was really going somewhere on this train. Oh, gee. About the identity. That's it. About the identity. And so, yeah, that's where I was going, the identity in Mississippi. And so, in the early 70s with I think it became magnified in everybody's minds during the big AIM movement. at Wounded Knee, the takeover at Wounded Knee when that occurred, and that was on television, and everybody was talking about it, and you know that was very historic. I think at that time it sort of triggered among our people, all Native peoples, you know, who are we? You know, Red Power, that word started coming out, and there just began to be an inward turn to really discern and identify and talk about who we were as Native peoples instead of being lost and not knowing who we were, or we know a little bit of this, culture of that, we know a little bit of that, this and that. And so, you know, one of the things I had always wondered is, you know, we didn't have dances, we didn't have games like some other tribes that still held them. And so 30s, 70s, right around that time that occurred with the AIM movement with the Native Americans, I think our pastor, Gene Wilson, and his wife, Alicia Wilson, got a grant from the Greater Presbyterian Church called Faith and Identity. And I believe a survey was sent out asking what were people interested in doing with this money to further your education or your spirituality, you know. And so one of the things that came back was people wanted to go to Mississippi to learn the dances. They wanted to know more about who we were before we were removed from Mississippi to Oklahoma. So that's how that had started. And I worked for the pastor as an intern the second year. I think they went 1 year before Curtis and I joined them the next couple of years. And it was really, really rewarding to get to visit with our kinspeople back in Mississippi, and you know, just looking out over the terrain. And as we were going down, it was some areas were just already so much like eastern Oklahoma, so much like home. It felt like home when we got there. And of course, the language, you know, that some of them spoke much faster than what we were used to. So we were constantly saying, you know, what was that? What was that? And then we met older people, other groups of people who spoke just like we did. There just wasn't hardly any difference, you know. So things like that were just very gratifying and rewarding to be a part of. And so I remember we stayed upstairs on top part of a building, and we'd bring in this couple. They were very well known. Amy and Curtis Jackson is who we spent time with, and he was a drummer. Was he the drummer? Singer. The chanter, and his wife sang with him. And so they taught us the dances, and you know, I took my part was writing down what they were saying in Choctaw, wrote it all down in a notebook, like as far as the dance steps, how do you do this? Remember to not pick your feet up far from the ground, and just a lot of little things that we needed to know, and they were so willing to share those things with us. So that was just one of many trips that we took to Mississippi, and making friends with people along the way. And I'll let Curtis take it from there, because that's how, well, actually the church, our pastor and some of the people that had gone together, they did start a community group, and they performed at different places. I know Wichita and McCurtain County was one of the places they participated in other places. So it was beginning to branch out and beginning to be a little well known that we had Choctaw dancers. And, you know, I never really had a problem with it, you know, as being a Christian, because, you know, you look at people, and all people do all kinds of dances. And the dances that we do are not to any kind of deity, or it's just a celebration of, it's social dances and a celebration of what the creation around us, and just acknowledging that. And so I know there were we had heard some feedback of some of our older people, you know, didn't quite know how to feel about it. But I think for us, and seeing our young people coming up, that this was just something that they also needed to know who you are as a Choctaw. And I think that's where our whole premise began in our walk, in our journey.
And within that atmosphere, I would like to say that also went to two or three schools, colleges. I went to UCO in Edmond and Northeastern at Tahlequah. And Tahlequah, they had several, it had the largest identifiable Indian students on campus, so that attracted me, so I went there, even though UCO was a great school of arts that I was interested in. And also the one of the persons 2 doors down from my dorm room was Mississippi Choctaw, and he also would we would talk a long time about the similarities of what we do in our language, and we would speak in Choctaw to each other, and things like that, and also he would explain like the dances, and he had a record that had all the chants that was recorded, and happened to be this guy Prentice Jackson that we had understudy under. But other than that, we would go to Bacon on Sundays sometimes, because there were some more Mississippi Choctaws that went to college there, and so we would go over there, and therefore I was pretty familiar with a lot of the things, and a lot of the things that I had read about and talked about. They didn't have too much idea of what I was inferring, so they would learn those kinds of things about themselves there. And then when we did go over there in the learning instruction, there was a student here at Southeastern, and I happened to work as a student in the Native American or Indian counseling center, and therefore we kept up with BIA grants and so forth, and I was pretty much just a clerk there, but did everything else that I needed to do. But within that realm, there was a Mississippi Choctaw that came, and so he was inviting us to come over and all that. And so when we started the dance session of trying to learn, then I just called him, since he just lived a couple miles from where we were at. He came over, and he would explain in English some of the things that Amy was saying in Choctaw, and sometimes they would talk among each other to see if that was correct or not, and so forth. But anyway, I recorded all of that kind of information on cassette, and we also went to his house, his parents' house, and other people of community, the chiefs, all the council people, and different things. And so I was always recording and taking photographs, and at the same time I would ask several questions of what I wanted to know, because I was always a student of Choctaw culture and history and so forth since I was in grade school, and so it was more of things that I was thinking I was going to find answers, but we actually didn't. Actually, we probably had more information than they did about themselves, and so in doing all of that, it was a good partnership and a great revitalization of our dances, or stickball, or the art of making the sticks, the weapons, basketry, all those things. They were still doing that at their fair, and we happened to be at the fair at that time. and their fair was just the football field. That was all it is. They didn't have any casinos or anything yet. This was like in 1972. So, and if you needed groceries or anything, you have to go off the reservation into town, which was at that time, coming under civil rights scrutiny, and all of those kinds of things were happening at that time.
And he wouldn't go. He sent me to town. He had long hair, so he didn't want to go to town.
But at any rate, I didn't want to get in confrontation with anybody, which I might. and so we also made several acquaintances that we could rely on, and one of the guys that was there also did the stickball. What would you would say? Announcer, play-by-play, and things like that, and his name was Bob Ferguson, who also was a songwriter before he married a Mississippi Choctaw and decided to live there. But I think one of his songs that might be familiar to people would be the On the Wings of a Dove. He wrote that song, and Carroll County Accident, several others, and he wrote for other people in Nashville. But he was kind of the historian for the tribe, or at least in written. He collected information, and so we would share information, and I would send him some things that pertain to pre-removal, and then he would print them out there and put them in his museum and things like that. So we had great relationship in that time, and he's I think that was a good contact, and everyone else and that we became a part of, we really enjoyed that type of atmosphere, and so we still have great relationship with people there, and some of the people like what's her name, the language woman?
Well, Roseanne Nickey of the language department,
Yeah.
Laura Sanders,
Yeah.
Jason Lewis,
And
several others.
yeah, there's several people, and several people have been deceased since then, but we still maintain great relationship with them since the 70s, and we would often make trips there during that time until present day. So I that was the implementation, and we also started implementing that in the public school at Broken Bow, and it's still there, the stickball and the dance and the dressmaking and all of those kinds of things, the leadership.
Yeah, so we've you've done so much, and we've all learned been able to, in Choctaw Nation, benefit from this kind of work that you've done, because now we have so many of your grandkids and kids who are very active, and there are people who who played stickball with you guys back in Broken Bow. Now they're teaching the new generation about stickball, and now we have a big tournament, although we won't have it this year, which is super sad. But we actually only have 3 minutes left.
Wow.
But it worked out because Todi answered a lot of the questions I had already written with the first question. But we did have one question, and I'll read it to you. This is from Ron McKinney, I think, and he says, now that there is a resurgence in learning the language and culture, what vision do you have for the future of not only preserving, but living our culture in today's society, especially for those of us who are living away from Choctaw Nation?
Answer.
ahead.
Go ahead. First part,
That's a long question. So what were our visions? Our vision for we just hope to see that it continues, and I think even opportunities like this that you have provided would help people like Ron and his family out there to take advantage of, even though they may live in another state. I think technology is definitely a big help in promoting our culture and our language, and it seems like no matter where Choctaws are, they want that connection, and I think we've strived in as many ways as we possibly can, and I'm sure that there's many other areas that we haven't even thought about tapping into, but hopefully it continues on.
And a lot of things that for the future would be to maintain, implement, and also to allow opportunities for people to demonstrate many of these things that they are a part of, not only the arts and crafts, but the dances, the stickball, the language, the storytelling, and all of the events that make us who we are, and songs, chants, endless pottery, the basketry, and could go on, and we I believe it's going to continue to improve and reclaim the total, and also place us in an area that we are who we are, and knowing who we are, and also knowing being able to excel in the larger society and community of this nation, as well as our nation. And we can do that side by side because it was already done in the 1880s in, with the Choctaw people of that day. So I can see that this is just seeds planted. And if you're a gardener, you might plant a seed not knowing what's going to happen, but once it starts germinating and you see the growth and you reap the fruit, then that's the same process that I think that we're taking at this point. I know we've seemed to have done a whole lot, but I think we've only just began. And I don't think we have arrived yet at that place where we will collectively have a greater, and I think that's in our youth, in our future, that they will attain all of those kind of things. Or that's all.
Well, that's really great. And I think that's a great kind of note to kind of close out this session, but we obviously should probably do more with both Teri and Todi, so we can probably maybe do that in the future. So that'll be the end of today's session. So I want to say Jakoke to Teri and Todi. I'm really glad that you were able to share all of your knowledge with us today. So for everyone at home, I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions that you guys kind of had, but we will do this again. So join us next time on Friday, August 7th at 2 p.m. when we will be hosting Dr. Donna Ackers, a historian and author of Living in the Land of Death, and she will be discussing her work on Choctaw removal and the years immediately after removal, which Todi did also touch a little bit upon today. And if you guys are really interested in stickball, since Labor Day was canceled, we have planned a two-part Chahta Tosholi about stickball exclusively. And so we will have that September 2nd and 3rd. So you can always check back for that. So that's it for now. Chiki Salachiki, everyone.
Yeah, Yakoke.
Okay.
Chimpon na hoke. Oyo.
teach me, so to you.